As you've been hearing, there's been heavy fighting between rebels and government forces in the Libyan town of Zawiya, with 30 people reported to have been killed as a result. Zawiya, 50 kilometers west of the capital Tripoli, was under rebel control. Nabila Ramdani is a journalist who specializes in the Middle East and writes for the Daily News Egypt. Nabila, first of all, who is in control of Zawiya tonight? Is that clear?
It's not very clear, or who is in control of the city, as clashes between pro and anti-Gaddafi groups are clearly gaining momentum, and the situation is escalating heavily. We have a situation where the rebels are trying to desperately gain control over more territories. They're in control of the eastern part of the country, but they're trying to push westwards to try to reach Tripoli and gain control over more territory around the main capital city. At the same time, we have pro-Gaddafi loyalists who are determined to not only consolidate their position in Tripoli and in the western part of the country, but also to try and regain control over the lost territory. So it's a bloody deadlock that we are witnessing at the moment.
A deadlock with Gaddafi troops essentially in control of the west of the country and the rebel troops essentially in control of the east. But I imagine there's a no man's land in the middle there somewhere.
It's hard to tell how the balance of power is at the moment, but what's for sure is of course the rebels are determined to topple Gaddafi, but it has to be said that the Gaddafi still very much has the upper hand. After all, he's better equipped, his loyalists are much better equipped than the rebels. The rebels are very much emboldened, they are determined, but it's not good enough. They need weapons, and they are running out of the basics like food and other basics that they need to carry on fighting, and that will catch up with them sooner rather than later.
The Sunday papers here are divided as to whether to call this a civil war as yet. Some papers are describing it as such. Other papers are still describing it as an uprising. What's your reading of the situation? Is it a civil war?
I think that there is clear evidence of people being killed and injured by the Gaddafi's regimes. We're seeing evidence of insurrection and, of course, bloody skirmishes. But I think we have to be extremely cautious of using the term civil war at this stage. I've also heard in some media reports the word genocide being used. I think we have to be extremely cautious about the terminology until we have tangible evidence of all that. And so far, we cannot describe the situation as either a civil war, let alone a genocide.
There's been a lot of talk about whether the West should intervene militarily. As far as I understand it, that wouldn't be popular amongst Libyans, but clearly there is some international intervention going on undercover to a certain extent. We're hearing in our news bulletin tonight that a group of British SAS soldiers have been captured by rebels. I don't know if you know anything about that specific incident, but clearly there are international troops on the ground operating, if not openly, then slightly undercover.
Very much so, and that's a rather disturbing development because it does concern me and indeed the Libyan population, of course, that a lot of Western interest, and especially from the US and the UK, is based upon establishing stability on their own terms. And I'm clearly referring to Libya's massive oil and gas reserves, which have largely been kept out of Western hands during Gaddafi's entire 42 years in power. And not only we're hearing that members of the SAS have been captured by the rebels, but the Americans are posting agents at the borders who are now gathering intelligence on the situation inside Libya. So it is quite cynical, in fact, this move from Western powers to try to basically determine the direction in which things should go. And, of course, as we said, there are terrible things going on in Libya, not least of all the tragic humanitarian crisis and indeed the casualties so far. But if we are to resolve the problems, we must do so in the interests of the Libyan people and not in the interests of the United States and their allies.
Moving on to Egypt, elsewhere in the same region, what's the situation there at the moment?
There are many things going on in Egypt, and it's fascinating what we are seeing in the wake of a revolution which took place not long ago. First of all, it's interesting to see that Egypt's ex-interior minister is now facing trial. And he's facing charges of money laundering and profiteering.
This is Habib El Adli.
Absolutely.
And he was feared as an interior minister. Why was he feared? What is it about his reputation that goes before him?
Well, first of all, he's one of Mubarak's notorious henchmen. He was in charge of the Interior Ministry. The Interior Ministry in Egypt is a very symbolic place because it represents the torture that was carried out by the Mubarak's regime. He was in charge of the Interior Ministry and indeed of the police forces. He had been in charge of these two positions for 14 years, and he was, of course, in charge of the security forces during the revolution, which led to the death of 365 people and 5,500 people being injured. Now, what's interesting is that in the wake of the revolution, we're seeing that the Egyptians are clearly demanding, some sort of accountability. They want people to be held accountable for all the crimes and murders that they committed. And it has to be said that largely the reports that came out of Egypt is that the role of the army during the revolution was quite neutral. But in fact, what we do know is that a lot of young men are still reported missing. A lot of people have disappeared during the revolution, and a lot of people have been indeed arrested and tortured. So a lot of horrific things were going on behind the scenes.
What about the former president, Mubarak himself? What's happened to him?
Well, of course, he left the country. He's now in exile in Saudi Arabia. But if Mubarak is now gone, well, the backbone of his regime is still very much in place. The people who are in charge of Egypt at the moment is a military dictatorship, effectively, and the demonstrators are very keen and very determined to ask for for some pressing demands to be implemented. For example, the release of political prisoners who were arrested and tortured for all the wrong reasons in the first place, for expressing dissent, effectively. They also want changes in the constitution, and they want all the people who committed crimes or indeed acts of corruption to be held accountable and put on trial.
So quite a lot of things going on, and in the middle of all of this, the Prime Minister that President Mubarak himself appointed before he left office has resigned now. Why?
Well, indeed, his former Prime Minister, Ahmed Shafiq, resigned because he took part in a television debate last week in Egypt with two other guests, one of them being a writer, who challenged the ex-Prime Minister's policies on air, and the ex-Prime Minister actually scolded him on television, and in the wake of that, he had to resign a day later under pressure from the country's military leadership. So the positive aspect in all that is that we're seeing some sort of a sense of justice being taking over in Egypt. There's a culture of dissent which is emerging, of free speech, and that's very welcome because obviously we're seeing gradual changes happening in Egypt in that respect.
Good to speak to you. Appreciate that. Thanks very much. That's the journalist for the Daily News Egypt and specialising in the Middle East, Nabila Ramdani.